Hello, everybody. I got a present, a gift for you today. We have Steven Kotler, who is a New York Times bestselling author, an award-winning journalist, and the executive director of the Flow Research Collective. He is one of the world's leading experts on human performance and the author of 10 bestsellers, but out of 13 books, and I think he actually has more books hidden away in his drawer. I don't know if he's going to share that or not, but some of my favorites are The Art of Impossible, The Future is Faster Than You Think, Stealing Fire. I'm rereading The Rise of Superman because it just is something that just is an incredible perspective on flow and athleticism and how to incorporate flow into your life. And his work has been nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He's been appeared in over 100 publications, including the New York Times Magazine, Wired, the Harvard Business Review, and the list goes on. But he's also the co-host of the Flow Research Collective Radio. So if you like what you hear today, make sure you check that out. It is in the top 10 iTunes science podcasts. And then also, I think a passion project, even though I think this is a passion project or a purpose project, with his wife and author Joy Nicholson. He is the co-founder of the Rancho de Chihuahua, which is a hospice and special needs dog sanctuary. So lots to talk about. Really excited to welcome Steven to the stage. How's it going?
It's good to be with you.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. So we're here to talk about lots of things, but mainly, I believe, flow. So can you define flow for our audience?
Sure. It's scientifically defined as an optimal state of performance, one where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, it refers to any of those moments of kind of rapt attention and total absorption. It's so focused on the task at hand. Everything else just seems to disappear. Action awareness are going to start to merge. Your sense of self, self-consciousness, that's going to diminish, get really quiet. Time's going to pass strangely. Usually it'll speed up and you'll get so sucked into what you're doing that 5 hours go by in like 5 minutes. Occasionally it'll slow down. You're going to freeze frame effect. Maybe anybody's been in a car crash or played action sports. And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. Now, there's a psychological definition for flow, which is how we psychologists would define it and measure it. We could take one step further. And then the work I do at the Flow Research Collective, where we look at the neurobiology of peak human performance and flow, the neurobiological markers that we would actually use to define flow, fill an entire page in terms of like, these are all the things we're looking for, think correlate with the state, or sometimes correlate with the state, or we hope correlate with the state, according to our research.
It's interesting as an ex-athlete, I understand flow. I've been there, I've done that, but I never really thought of flow as something that is a part of my work life in the professional world, sitting behind a desk or in a meeting. But when I was reading through your work, I started recognizing that I go into flow when I'm working. And it took me by surprise. And when I'm working with leaders today, because I think our audience is a lot of, senior executives and senior leaders, I think, they say that they're seeking passion or they're seeking purpose, but honestly, what I really think they're seeking is more flow and a greater level of flow in their life.
So I think there's 2 answers here. One, you don't have passion because of how the biology works, human biology. You don't often get passion and purpose without also getting an increase in flow. So they tend to be wrapped up together. But I think from a addictive neurobiological, we're addicted to feel good neurochemistry standpoint, yeah, of course, it's the flow. Passion and purpose are the vehicle that get you more flow, which is, widely tops charts of, everybody's favorite feeling on the planet. It underpins well-being, life satisfaction. The upper 2 tiers of happiness that are available to humans are defined by psychologists in terms of how much flow you get and where it comes from. So these things are very wrapped up with one another. But I want to go back to where you started because it unlocks a much more interesting door. And I actually have to, for us to do it properly, I have to go now tell you how psychologists define flow because you led us there. So you said flow shows up at work, and I know it from athletics, but I was surprised to find it at work. And wow, there's all this. I wrote a book called Flow in Business. I wrote a book called Bold about how to apply flow concepts in the business world and organizations. We do a tremendous at the Flow Research Collective. We work with tons of, we work for a lot of Fortune 500 CEOs and C-suite executives, but we train up whole companies from we're working right now with Audi. We're working with Accenture. We're working with ACEs. ACEs is an organization of psychologists who work with families of autistic children. So wide variety of organizations. There's a lot of work here. what are we talking about when we say flow shows about work? What does that feel like? What does that look like? So psychologists define flow because the state itself has 6 phenomenological characteristics, right? Ways the experience makes us feel. How do you know if you're in flow? Well, there's complete concentration on the task at hand. There's a merger of action and awareness. There's the vanishing of self, the elongation or dilation of time. We don't register peak performance as, oh my God, I'm kicking ass right now. We register it as, oh my God, I've got control over situations and feel things that I don't normally control, right? You're a basketball player. Suddenly the basket is big as a hula hoop. You're a writer. Suddenly you have a facility with language that is not normally at your fingertips. Suddenly you're leading a business meeting and you're just taking in directions that you can't normally get the organization to go. All those things are kind of flow experiences. That's a sense of control. And finally, the experience itself is autotelic, which is a fancy way of saying an end in itself. It makes us feel incredibly good, euphoric, wonderful, addictive, right? Anyways, you can be in a state of microflow, which is what happens at work. And this is where people get confused. They think flow is one thing, macro flow, when all 6 of those conditions show up, turned up to 11. It's a spectrum of experiences. It's like anger, a little irked, homicidally murderous. It's the same emotion and the body produces it the same way. Same thing with flow. There's micro flow. You go to work, you sit down to write a quickie email, right? You get so sucked into what you're doing, you look up an hour later, you've written an entire essay, right? And the work is really exciting. It's really good. And you didn't notice time passing. And maybe your sense of self didn't totally vanish, or you didn't become one with everything, things that happen kind of in macro flow. And instead you're like, oh my God, I really got to go to the bathroom and I didn't notice. And you run to the toilet. That's really common. That's micro flow. Other end of the experience, that's what you're talking about in athletics. That's macro flow. Time slows down and, the basket becomes as big as a hula hoop. And that's macro flow. And, psychologists misdiagnosed is, I guess, wrong, but not entirely misdiagnosed macro flow for the first 50 years. We've been studying it until really Abraham Maslow came along. They called it a mystical experience, not meaning we couldn't explain the phenomenon, but it was an experience that only showed up in spiritual and religious communities. And then Abraham Maslow found an entire group of high achievers use flow to kind of drive their high achievement. And the one unusual variable in this particular study group, they were all atheists. Everybody who was looking at in this study group was an atheist, but he was looking at major scientists, Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, and people along these lines, and they were very much academics and they were very much atheists, and so suddenly he renamed what had been mystical experiences peak experiences. Csikszentmihalyi came along and renamed them flow states, because that's the experience of being in flow. Every action, every decision flows seamlessly, perfectly, effortlessly to the next. And when you went around the world doing the initial foundational research on flow, this is how people kept describing it over and over and over. It didn't matter who he talked to. He could be talking to a Detroit assembly line worker, a Navajo sheep herder, an Italian grape farmer, expert rock climber, expert surgeon, expert stockbroker. They all said flow is flowy. So that's where the term comes from.
Why should people care about flow? And I mean, like the average everyday person, or does it tend to be the high achievers, the innovators, the creators that should care about flow? Or should it be more of a global kind of movement towards how do we practice and increase the flow in our life?
I don't work in shoulds. You know what I mean? Like I know what I like. You get to make your own decisions. That's what we call being an adult. But here's what I can tell you. Once sort of the foundational psychology we've been talking about got done, everybody was like, oh, optimal performance. How optimal? What the hell are we actually talking about? What gets optimized? And we could talk about why all this smattering of things that I'm about to talk about get optimized at once. But the short version is every human being is hardwired for flow. Every human being is hardwired for peak performance, which is what flow is good for. What do we mean by that? These studies come from all over the place. So if you want, like, who did the study, just ask me, but I'll just give you some of the numbers. Motivation, grit, and productivity spike some 500% in flow. Learning rates, and this is work done by the U.S. Department of Defense, though it's been repeated elsewhere, spiked 240 to 500% above normal. Work that we did at the Flow Research Collective, that was done at Harvard, that was done at the University of Sydney, and a bunch of other places, we see creativity spike. And by creativity, I mean like when psychologists break apart creativity, there are like 16 different sub skills, from problem identification to solution execution, blah, blah, blah. All of them spike 400 to 700% above normal. We see your interests are teams and organizations and leaders. So there's group flow, shared collective flow state. We see cooperation, collaboration spike, empathy. We are in the middle of a huge social justice movement. We are training dozens of police forces right now. That may be an exaggeration, but half a dozen police forces right now. One, because they're interested in flow, but mainly they're interested in empathy. To be a cop in today's world demands way more empathy. And how do we get more empathy? One of the only ways it can be trained outside of like compassion meditation is via flow. So there's a lot of advantages there. We also, and this is the kind of the no-brainer, because this is everywhere. If you're interested in happiness, well-being, overall life satisfaction, as I said, you can't really have those things without a high flow lifestyle. You really can't. You can't have passion, purpose. Like, you don't get all those things without a high flow lifestyle. That's often what we mean. Meaning, purpose, like flow, is neurobiologically baked into the definition of those terms. So most everything a lot of people are sort of seeking in their private lives and their work lives, flow. It's not a panacea, by the way. It's not like, I have a new book out called The Art of Impossible that says, look, flow is fantastic for peak performance. It's absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. There's more to the puzzle than just the big deal. Is we're all biologically hardwired for flow. It's universal. Most mammals can get into flow. All social mammals can get into flow, and all humans can get into flow. As you pointed out, studies show that we spend about 5% of our work life in flow. And a crazy study, McKinsey, looked at flow and productivity over a long period of time. And they looked at that number and realized that if we could increase the percentage points we spend in flow from 5% of our work life to 20%, globally, overall workplace productivity would double. So
Unreal.
Hey, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
whatever you're after, flow has to be part of the solution, because we're human beings and this is our biology. Like, this is how we're hardwired to do this stuff. So, I always say that peak performance is nothing more or less than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. Flow is a big part of that biology.
So when I reflect back on my own personal experiences and working with clients, there's something that blocks people from even working towards flow. And so it's either, some people may call it procrastination, or they can't find the commitment to actually start having the focus that they need, or to take action that they need to. What have you seen to be the biggest roadblock between someone actually being able to go through the steps that you've ironed out to create flow? Because it is a process.
So, there's a twofold answer. So let me give you the short version, and then let me elaborate on it a little bit more. So the short version is, you're kind of wrong and you're kind of right. Let me tell you why you're wrong first, and then let me tell you why you're right second. Flow states have triggers. You want more flow in your life? There are 22 known neurobiological triggers for flow. Flow follows focus. It only shows up when all of our attention is in the right here, right now. So that's what the triggers do. They drive attention into the present moment. To put it differently, evolution said there are about 22 things that are super important to your survival. And when these things show up, you're going to freaking pay attention to them.
Bear,
lion. Right? Those kinds of, risk is only one small
Yeah.
example of them. Novelty is another. Complexity is another. Pattern recognition is another. There's a whole bunch of them. And we could get technical, and I could say, look, they drive attention by either pushing dopamine or norepinephrine into our system, or they lower cognitive load. And we can talk about what all that means. But the short version is, if you want more flow in your life, that's your toolkit. And how useful is it? We train about 1,000 people a month at the Flow Research Collective, and we've done this for a while. And we measure flow pre and post using the standard psychological instrument. And on average, we see a 70 to 80% boost in flow. So that is available to each and every one of us. But here's the part where you're totally right. It's a process. Flow is a cycle. It's a 4-stage process, and you have to like move through the complete cycle to actually get into a flow state. We know that there's different neurobiological changes under each level of the cycle. More importantly, well, I can massively use these biological triggers, right? Like I put you in front of a black bear, you're going to get a huge squirt of dopamine. It's going to drive you, into flow. And if you live through this experience, you're right that it's going to be a flow state kind of experience, unless you're in a full fight or flight panic, right? But chances are, if you live through the experience, it's going to be flowy along the way. That's sort of automatic. But if you want a high flow lifestyle, you really want to put this into play in your work environment. And what happens is that huge increase in flow, it's not sustainable over time. To do that, you have to train up the other 3 aspects of peak performance. Flow is one of 4 kind of, when I say the biology of peak performance, what is that biology? Well, there's a bunch of motivation skills. This is extrinsic motivation, intrinsic motivation, grit and goals, right? There are a bunch of learning skills. There are a bunch of creativity skills, and there are a bunch of flow skills. What is that? Why those 4? What's that quartet? Any challenge you face, you need the motivation to get into that game. You need learning to allow you to continue to play, right? To progress at it. Creativity, especially if you're going after hard challenges where how do I quite get there? I don't know. Creativity is how you steer. And flow, optimal performance, is how you turbo boost the results kind of beyond reasonable expectation. That's how the system is designed to work. And you have to train up all aspects of motivation, all aspects of learning, all aspects of creativity. Otherwise, you cannot sustain flow over time. And so that's why it's a slightly more complicated answer, but that's the full picture.
And it's interesting how I've been working with clients over the years because, for me, I saw, well, why are people taking action? Well, there's a lack of clarity in terms of what they care about, passion or purpose and process. And then they don't have confidence in themselves in terms of self-efficacy and self-esteem, and they haven't prioritized it in their life. So how do we craft an environment around themselves that relates to what they care about so they're more motivated to actually prioritize the things and create those states of flow in their life and to progress? And I know it's very broad and not as specific as what you just said, but I can see bits and pieces of that on why certain things have actually worked.
Let me just walk you through what the science could tell us, and you'll understand exactly why this stuff works, because it fits sort of inside this thing. You have to start. Peak performance is difficult, and life is difficult, right? Like the life itself is hard. It's hard here, and it's hard for everyone, as far as I can tell. And peak performance itself, like being at our best, performing at our best in the things we're going to do, whatever the hell it is, whether it's at work, with our family, as an athlete, as a creative, we all wear a lot of those hats. And to perform at our best in those situations is challenging. And as an athlete, when you go,
it's supposed to suck, right?
But when you go into a game, because it's going to be physically hard, you absolutely make sure you got as much sleep as you could possibly get the night before, and you make sure that you've trained right, you've eaten right, you're well hydrated, you've got carbs, you've got proteins, you've got fat, like you've stacked all available fuel sources so you can meet the challenge of the game or the activity, whatever. Same thing with psychological motivators. And what the research shows is that if you're interested in optimizing performance, you want to start with motivation. You have to start with extrinsic motivation. Research is really clear. If you don't make enough money to pay your bills and have a little left over for fun, just a little, you don't actually need much. There's too much fear in the system, and it blocks peak performance. It blocks a lot of stuff that we need. So that's the challenge you have to solve first. The research is pretty overwhelmingly clear on that one. Once that challenge is solved, you have to start. You need all of your intrinsic motivators, just like you need all your fuel sources. You need curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, and mastery, because these are the big 5 intrinsic motivators. Now, and they're biologically designed, by the way. One is designed to be built into the next. Curiosity is designed to be built into passion, which is designed to be built into purpose. Once you have a purpose, you need autonomy, the freedom to pursue your purpose. Once you have the freedom, you need mastery, which is the ability to pursue that purpose well. Now, mastery is one of these tricky words. And what do we mean by mastery? And this is where confidence comes back into the question. What we usually mean by mastery is the same thing as we mean by the challenge skills balance in flow science. So flow's most important trigger is what's known as the challenge skills balance. It's the idea we pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch, but not snap. It's sort of at the halfway point between boredom, not enough stimulation here, I don't care. Anxiety, whoa, way too much, I care too much, right? In between is the sweet spot. If you speak physiology, you often talk about this as the Erbs-Dobson curve. It's the same thing. If you are talking about motivation science, this is the sweet spot, the optimal zone for learning and mastery, right? Like they're all the same thing. Here's where you said something interesting. So psychologists have gone nuts since Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, sort of the godfather of flow psychology, discovered the challenge skills sweet spot back in early 70s. Trying to say, well, okay, well, what the hell do we mean by challenge? And what the hell do you mean by skills? And that's where things get tricky, because there are modifiers. Culture plays a role in how do we find challenge and skills. Confidence plays a huge role. In fact, Susan Jackson, who wrote Flow in Sports with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, did some studies in I think professional ice skaters, I want to say, and definitely college athletes, which I know you are, and found that at that level, often what we mean by skills, 81% of it is often is confidence. And 19% is actually, do you have the skills? Now, mind you, once you get to college level or pro level, skills start to equalize out, right? You can't get to AA sports if you don't have AA skills. You can't get to single A, right? So there's other filters that sort of determine that sort of equalize those things out. And once that happens, confidence becomes huge. Self-esteem becomes enormous. Ability to delay gratification, tolerance for anxiety. These are really like sort of foundational psychological elements that I'm sure when you were talking about self-esteem and confidence, you were working with. And then, by the way, once you get all this stuff, where do you go next? Goal setting. The system says, okay, you got all that stuff. Now you need goals, right? You've got mastered the skills. What are your goals? And you need your immediate goals. You need your hard goals, like 1 to 5 year goals. And then you need your lifetime goals, your mission level goals, your purpose. And they all have to be pointed in the same direction. And they all have to be pointed in the same direction as all 5-year intrinsic motivators. And most of those intrinsic motivators do double duty as flow triggers, because when we're curious about shit, we pay more attention to it, and we get a lot of dopamine, which drives focus into it even more, and a little bit of norepinephrine, which drives focus a little bit more. And when we're passionate, holy crap, that's a lot of dopamine and a lot of norepinephrine, and we're really focused. And right, like there's no difference between I'm passionate about what I do at work and I'm passionate for this guy or this girl I met the night before. They're both large amounts of dopamine and norepinephrine. And think about the guy or the girl you met the night before and how much you couldn't stop paying attention to them and how you didn't have to work for that. Focus for free. That's the big deal about intrinsic motivators.
Yeah, when you redefine passion or purpose as just an opportunity to create motivation and feel good chemicals to take action and create something in the world, I think our perspective on, or the perspective on what a passion needs to be or what purpose needs to be can tend to evolve, because if not, you're just in this cycle of achievement orientation.
And purpose is so funny because from a neurobiological standpoint, here's the only thing. The brain is less effective when you're being totally selfish. Meaning, if I'm just passionate, I'm going to get norepinephrine and dopamine. But the minute it becomes purpose, oh, there are other people involved, there are animals involved, the planet as a whole is involved. Now you're getting pro-social neurochemicals, oxytocin, endorphins, serotonin, more pleasure chemicals. So it's literally, I mean, whether or not there is a spiritual value, a higher value, an ethical, like all of that is essentially besides the point. From a performance standpoint, when you involve other people in the equation, because we're social animals, you get more feel-good juice, and that is more motivation.
Now, does it matter if it's feel good, I'm doing something for other people, or if I'm working with other people, like the team flow or personal kind of flow that impacts a group?
So those are trickier questions. Studies show, by the way, that individuals tend to prefer group flow to individual flow. We like group flow more than we like individual flow. I will tell you that's probably because they haven't spent enough time studying introverts. And I think that's a very individual thing. I am I don't like groups. I'm an introvert. My wife is an introvert, right? You're an introvert, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to be like, my least favorite experiences are often with groups, and like just being in a group makes it often hard for me to get into flow. I think that's what alcohol is for.
Well, there's my attention is diluted when I'm in a group, where I play a certain role in that group that doesn't allow me to get into this in a similar state. But it's interesting what you said, because I didn't know you were an introvert. Because what I know about your background is that you also were like a pro magician, and you were a bartender at some point. And what?
No,
right?
Yeah. So you have to understand that I am wired very differently than certain people, which is like, anytime there's a weakness, I take it as like a deep assault on my soul. And, I have to go right at it. And so I'm really good on stage. I'm really good on TV and on radio and on podcasts and all those things. And the reason is that I've spent 40 years practicing, right? I started out as a little kid in theater, which is what very quickly I discovered. I was like kindergarten. I did a play, and I was like, oh my God, I'm terrified of this. I hate being on stage. Like, the whole process of learning the play and doing that was all great. And then when it came time to actually do it, I couldn't act to save my life. And magic was more of the same. I loved doing magic and practicing magic and the art of magic. I hated making a living. And I got a job when I was 11 years old. I was doing 3 shows every Saturday and 3 shows every Sunday from the time I was 11. I've been working since I was 11 in restaurants doing I just don't like being afraid of things, and I don't like being bad at things. So I'm willing to, and I'm a very slow learner. Which is, I'm just willing to work at things for 20 to 30 to 40 years to get better at them.
Did you enter states of flow in those moments? Because I know that I was pretty bad socially. When I lost soccer, I kind of had to redefine myself and had to get out there and really practice social dynamics and build the confidence in myself again and a brand identity. And I bartended too for 10 years, but because it was so challenging to me, it became almost like a game, and that novelty and that the focus ended up being almost like a drug, where I was like, okay, I think now that I look back on it, I was in flow. I was in flow with those moments of growth.
I found bartending itself, I worked in very, 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 very busy bars. So bartending itself, I don't think is possible without flow. Mixing drinks is a very complicated physical skill. Doing it when you've got, customers 5 deep and it's Saturday night, is you're moving really, really fast. You can't have a lot of conscious involvement, which is also really funny to me, because this was back in the day, before, when I was doing it, a lot of the cash registers weren't computer systems, right? I worked in old bars in San Francisco where they you would count everything by hand, and you would have to do really complicated math in your head all the time. And I find it really interesting that I was doing I could add 11 drinks up in my head while making 6 more drinks without conscious involvement. That I found interesting. And I'm not particularly gifted at math, but I found it really interesting that I could learn, really complicated sort of addition without any conscious involvement.
Well, to that point, it's funny, because the same thing, it's almost like I just trusted my mind when it would come up with the right number at a time. And you said something about this conscious involvement, and I've listened to some other things that you've said, and flow is really right. It's turning off that awareness.
It is turning off. So part of what happens in flow is defined as transient temporary hypofrontality. Hypo is HYPO. It's the opposite of hyper. It means to shut down or slow down or deactivate. And frontality is the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's right back here. And in flow, large swatches of the prefrontal cortex, and which swatches exactly seem to differ depending on what exactly you're doing. But large swatches of the prefrontal cortex appear to deactivate in flow. One of the reasons our self disappears in flow and time passes so strangely is because both our sense of self and our ability to calculate time are network processes, right? They're huge portions of the prefrontal cortex working together. And in flow, these portions of the brain are turned down, often for energy efficiency reasons. Like we need a lot of energy for focus and attention on the present moment. The brain says, okay, what can I shut down? What's not critical? Where can I repurpose energy? Brain is a giant energy hog, right? It uses 25% of our energy at rest. It's 2% of our mass. So it's enormous amounts of calories every moment to basically run the brain. The brain has to be very, very efficient. And if you're doing something super challenging, playing soccer, tending bar, performing surgery, writing an essay, the brain says, okay, you got to focus here. And, you need certain skills to do this thing. Everything that's not critical, we're going to shut down so we can give you more energy. That's what happens to our sense of self and flow. That's what happens to our ability to calculate time and flow. And it's very subtle. So I'll give you a simple example. I chased professional athletes around for a very long time as a journalist, right? Mostly action adventure sport athletes. And I found it very difficult to get into flow along the way. And I was making the weirdest error in the world. It was like, it's not obvious what I was doing wrong. I spent so much time sort of chasing these athletes around. I knew what they looked like when they skied or when they surfed. So in my mind, I had this visualization for how good skiing or good surfing or good mountain bike riding would look. And so I would try to map my body onto their body. Oh, was my style like their style? And I'm like, that actually kept my prefrontal cortex active. It required self-reflective cognition. And I didn't know it. It was just, I was blocking flow for years. And then one day, this is such a self-conscious, horrible, odd thing to have to admit out loud. I realized, I was like, you know what, man? Nobody gives a fuck how you look, because when you're with a group of athletes, you're all moving too fast. If you're moving as fast as them, they're never going to notice what you look like because you're moving too fast. And I was like, so you can, the introvert in me was super self-conscious about it. And I was like, you could put that down as long as you focus on speed. So speed became my new metric. Instead of how my body is positioned, what does it look like? Speed became the thing I started focusing on when I was skiing, when I was surfing, when I was mountain biking. And the minute I switched my focus to an external metric, when we now know this, when you complete concentration is a flow trigger, but it's complete concentration on an external metric. And we now know that, right? We didn't know that. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have made that mistake for 15 years, which was rough.
I'm just thinking about how, you try to fix somebody's form when really they just need to let go and focus on that external indicator up to a point, I imagine.
That's the tricky thing. And I think the answers are very individual here. This is one of the reasons why I get very cautious with what works for me is not going to work for you. Because there's so many individual, there's certain biology, dopamine is going to drive focus. And drive attention in the present moment. This is true in all mammals, right? And but your risk tolerances are really different than my risk tolerances, and we're both introverts, and they're massively different than extrovert risk tolerances or openness to experience or all these other kind of trait-based things that are individual, as shaped by nature and nurture and set up sort of locked into place pretty early on. And while you can change them in adult life, you want to reset your risk tolerances. You have to do it very slowly over time, right? It's a 5-10 year process, not I can do this in a week.
I thought about something earlier, and I think it comes up right now with these idea of almost not epiphany moments, but all of a sudden things just click and work after practicing and practicing and practicing, or learning a specific technique, or these, for example, I'm trying to study something or understand a concept for a month, and then I get up one day and I'm at the gym working out, and then I finally get it and it clicks. Is any of that related to the flow research that you've done?
Yeah, it's completely. It's related 3 or 4 different ways. So what happens in flow essentially is we have learned with any skill, right, or any knowledge base. It's not one thing, right? When you want something simple, like how do you swing a baseball or a bat at a ball, right? You got to step into the pitch. You got to twist your hips in a certain way. You got to hold your wrist at a certain level. You got to follow through your swing. You got to do certain things with your eye, blah, blah, blah. Those are individual motor programs. And essentially they all have to be learned individually, right? And they come together into this one fluid thing that we call a perfect swing. when things like that come together, or when 2 or 3 of those smaller chunks come together to form a larger schema at once, to use psychological terms here, whenever that happens, that's flow. You're going to drop into flow along the way. That will produce flow. And flow helps you stitch them together. There is an argument that I love that I wish I made. I didn't, but that's coming out of some of the European. There's probably 100 different really brilliant European flow researchers in the European, and they've been doing a lot of work on this. And there's a bunch of people who posited a new sort of evolutionary theory behind flow. And there's like 3 or 4 reasons why we think flow evolved. But one of the things that they think flow evolved for is a signal of mastery, a signal of learning, a signal of you have learned this skill now, which from a survival standpoint, right? You want to know, right? You go into a certain situation. Oh, I got to fight this predator with my spear. Have I mastered my spear fighting skills, or am I still an advanced beginner, right? Just with too much false confidence. You better know for sure, because that's a saber-toothed tiger kind of situation we evolved in. So the thinking is flow is the signal of, hey, you've got it. And you're going to have it from here on out, because flow so amplifies learning and memory that once we experience it in a flow state, it's sort of in the skill set, and can be reliably called upon, is one of the thinkings for flow. So all flow has a lot, like there's like 5, yes, but in 5 or 6 different ways.
Yeah, that almost like imprinting in a way of knowledge is really interesting to me, because as I reflect back on flow in my own life, yes, I maybe had that now skill, or I realized I had that skill, or I learned how to do some new technique that I wasn't sure about, but accessing the emotions that came with that state were very far from that skill itself. It's a magical place to be, and I know that you help individuals get into that state.
But you also have to. We
long
also have
periods
to
of time.
remember what, like, the goal is not. Let's talk about this athletically, because you're going to know this from soccer. Getting into a flow state and being able to perform a skill is phenomenal. But the really cool thing is what happens like 2 months later, which is where you get to perform the exact same skill without flow. Mm-hmm. Right? You've totally leveled up now. That day is usually like on skiing. I always think of the day that, like, early season, I'll do something incredible in a flow state, and then like a month later, I'll do it without flow, and it'll be a miserable experience. Like the work involved, the pain involved, the grit involved it'll really hurt, but I'll take great satisfaction, because then I'm like, okay, this is locked and loaded, and I can do it in a bad situation when I'm not in flow. Fantastic. That's really exciting to me. So I also think that's important to know, because that's true. That's true. There were things I could do in words in flow in some of my earlier books. In my later books, I learned how to write the same way without having pattern recognition and sort of a bunch of creative skills all the way wrapped up. And then that allowed me to build on that with kind of new learning, right? So I think there's something to be said for having the experience in flow as delightful, but I think there's something else to be said for savoring the magnificence of pulling something difficult off with zero flow and doing it, because that's really, truthfully, to borrow a phrase from David Foster Wallace, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, flow is not always accessible. You want to be able to do the stuff that you learned in flow without flow in the day-to-day trenches of adult life. And, so while it's really neat that we can get a 70-80% boost in flow, there's a lot, as we said when we started this thing, there's more to the story, right? Because you want to be able to do that same stuff without flow. Flow, I don't think, is the destination. It's a point along the way.
That is a beautiful place to stop, and to motivate our listeners to find, if they're interested in learning more about you and about flow, where should they go?
So flowresearchcollective.com is a great place to learn more about me and learn more about flow. The Art Impossible, which is my new book, is really a peak performance primer. It's a how-to breakdown of how to apply motivation tools, learning tools, creativity tools, and low tills. And it's the full picture and how the system works and how the system works together. And So that's everything you need to know to get your hands dirty. And a gift for your readers, because they're probably now thinking, all right, this flow shit seems pretty cool and I'd like some more. So we know, we meaning the field of flow researchers, there are about 6, there's probably way more, but there's 6 that we know of, major flow blockers, things that stand between most of us and more flow. And because of personality stuff, most of us are really susceptible to one major one. So we built a diagnostic. And if you go to www.flowblocker.com, it's free for anybody. It's a diagnostic. It'll say this is the thing that tends to stand between you and more flow. And here's a couple of action steps to take to fix that in your life. So those are 3 options. And yeah, marketing plug over.
Yeah, throwing in the link. I'll put all those links in the notes.
Thanks, man.
And I mean, this has been, I actually took the flow blocker quiz earlier before coming on. So it was wonderful and had some pretty cool content that comes up afterwards. So I highly recommend everyone check that out. Thank you so much, Steven, for your knowledge and your wisdom. This has been, a selfish conversation, but also hopefully a lot of people get some gems out of this too, because it was full of it.
Well, it was fun hanging out with you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.